Hello, this is Pastor Don Long. Once again, here we are as we speak about being grafted in, the study and discussion about how as Christians we are grafted into our Jewish roots. Last week was the beginning of Hanukkah, and we're just finishing up with the Hanukkah season. I shared some letters written stories about Hanukkah last week. I want to continue in that theme to remind you that Hanukkah is a story that evolved when the Jewish people as a nation had begun to lose their identity. Alexander the Great had taken over most of the Middle East, Syria, Egypt, Palestine. But Alexander was a kind of a conqueror who allowed everybody to continue to practice their own religion. However, when he died, the empire was divided, and eventually one of the successors in the area of Syria, Palestine, was Antiochus IV. And Antiochus IV was the opposite kind of ruler. He wanted everything to be the one religion he approved of, and therefore he attacked all that was Jewish. There was no circumcision allowed, synagogues weren't allowed, prayer claws weren't allowed. He desecrated the temple, offered swine as sacrifices on the altar. And this was an increasingly unbearable situation for nearly 2 decades, when finally a nationalist by the name of Mattathias the Hasmonean and his son Judah Maccabee just rose up against the government authorities and called the people to arms. We need to fight to get our country back. And so we had the Maccabean revolt. And like so many events in Jewish history and even current contemporary Jewish history, miracles happen. And God delivered the nation of Israel from Antiochus IV. The nation became independent. The revolution succeeded, and the temple was recaptured, and it was rededicated. And in the process of the rededication, the Talmud tells us that when they went to light the menorah, the 7-branch menorah that was in the holy place, that there was only enough of the dedicated, purified holy oil to last for 1 day. The process to make that oil was about a 7-day process, so they weren't going to have enough to light it now and keep it going, but they decided to light it anyway. And miracle of miracles, the story goes that the candle oil lasted for the entire 8 days. And thus we have for Hanukkah the 8-branch, if you count the shamash, which is the servant candle in the middle. There's actually 9 candles there, but there's 8 branches. We have the 8-branched candle of Hanukkah celebrating those days. Again, the question is, why as Christians are we involved in Hanukkah? Interestingly, Hanukkah, the Feast of Dedication, is mentioned in the New Testament in John chapter 10. John goes out of his way to indicate that Yeshua was in Jerusalem for Hanukkah. That had to be a deliberate trip because you didn't just go down for a day or two from Galilee down to Jerusalem. Yeshua would have come down for the major pilgrimage festivals, but he comes down at the season of Hanukkah, and there he's asked to clearly identify him. Yeshua is the one who said, "I am the light of the world," a very appropriate message for Hanukkah, that light shines in darkness. And so there are 2 great miracles at Hanukkah. The first is that the Maccabees actually win the fight over the Greek Seleucid army. And then the second is the miracle of the small cruse of oil that keeps the candelabra burning for 8 nights. The questions that the rabbis address is an interesting one. Of those 2 miracles, you have the rebellion, the people who are the nationalists saying, "We want our country back." So they go to war against the Seleucid army. That is the bigger miracle, one would think. I mean, defeating your nationalistic enemies, defeating an army. You're not a trained army yourselves. You're a group of like guerrilla fighters. That is huge. That is the fact that the Jewish rebellion succeeded It's kind of like our own Revolutionary War. That's a miracle. How on earth did the American colonies ever succeed in defeating Great Britain? I mean, Great Britain is a world empire. How on earth did the colonial armies ever manage to do that? Well, there was a lot of miracles in the Revolutionary War, and so it was in the Maccabean Revolt. And so one would think that that's the great miracle, and the small miracle is, gee, we went to light the candle and it lasted for 8 days. But when the rabbis address the question of why is it that we remember and talk about the smaller miracle, the oil, is simply this. The reason we remember it, this is God's way of saying, I am the source of miracles. You see, the Maccabean rebellion, people could say, look what our hand did. We got together, we fought the Greeks, we won the battles, we did all this work, and failed to see the miracle of God. It's like the 6-day war when Israel defeated Egypt and Jordan and Syria, and the armies of the Middle East had come against her, threatening to annihilate her. Nasser said, this is a time to annihilate Israel. And in 6 days, the war is won by Israel, out of which people can have a tendency to say how great Israel is. Israel's powerful, and for, the world in a negative way likes to say, well, that's Israel, they're the bully. They're not the bully. They were threatened out of their existence, but they won the war in 6 days, and you can step back and say the amazing Israelis, or you can say the God of the Israelis is amazing. The God of Israel is an amazing God. But when human beings do so much in participating in an outcome, we tend to take all the credit to ourselves. Look what I've done. We forget that if it weren't for God, you wouldn't even have the breath to breathe. Look what I've done with my life. We forget that if it wasn't for God, the circumstances of your life wouldn't have opened, doors of opportunity that led you to where you became successful. It's so easy when man is involved to say, look what we've done. But for the cruise of oil, for the fact that you have 1 day's supply of oil and it goes on and on and on and on, there's only one source of that. You can't claim that yourself. It's a miracle of God. It's like Yeshua when the wine runs out at the wedding feast in Cana of Galilee, and he's asked, gee, they've run out of wine, Mary says to him. And so he tells his servants, fill these pitchers with water, and now dip some out and take it to the master of ceremonies, and the water turned to wine. Not just wine, turned to the best wine. The master of ceremonies says most people use the best wine first. Near the end of the celebration, they bring out the cheaper stuff. You save the best to last. Well, that's obviously not something man did. Man doesn't know how to do that, but God does that. The miracle of Hanukkah is the miracle of the cruse of oil. It's not the winning of the battle over the Seleucid army. It's the fact that God's involved in bringing redemption. He's involved in turning things around in your life. And when it looks like for decades your life has been a failure, God is the one who can bring light out of that darkness, restoration out of that defeat. God is the one who, when we rely on Him, can do the things we call miracles. And so the message of Hanukkah is that the spiritual always outweighs the temporal. That which is of the Spirit precedes. The things in the natural world, the Bible tells us, are a copy of the things that are spiritually true. The temporal things, Paul says, everything that you can see will vanish and disappear. But the things which are spiritual are eternal. Your physical body, we can even look at that. Whether you live the biblical mandate at 120 years or whether you live 60 years. Whether you were to get to 150 years, it makes no difference. The point is, the physical body in this world will eventually cease working. It'll die and go the way of the world. But your spirit man will live forever. The things of the spirit go on forever. The things of the material will eventually vanish. And in fact, the Bible talks about in the end times, and after the millennium, that God is going to roll up the universe like you roll up a scroll. And that there's going to be a new heaven and a new earth. It's like in a moment of time, all the physical universe as we know it is going to collapse. It's going to disappear. It's going to be rolled up like a piece of paper. But it's going to be replaced with a brand new, let there be light, let there be a new heaven, let there be a new earth. Well, that's of the Spirit. The Spirit goes forever, the physical doesn't. And so the question in Hanukkah is, why do we light the candles? And little Jewish children learn to ask this question growing up. Why do we light the candles? And the two answers are, number one, we light the candles to publicize the miracle. We're lighting candles to demonstrate, and this has been going on now for over 2,000 years. We light the candle as a reminder that of the miracle, of what God did. He brought light out of darkness. And secondly, the light is to shine in public. Don't put your light under a bushel, is what Yeshua will say. Well, you can imagine the imagery of the menorah being lit, but you hide it under a bushel. No, it's meant to be declared in the public. And last week we read that amazing story of the Jewish family escaping from Nazi Germany. And it was Hanukkah the last night. They wanted to light the candles, but how could they? And while they're on the train, they are trying to figure out what to do. When all the lights go out in the station, the man lights the candles, and the Gestapo comes up, but they're so pleased he has candles because now they can see to check people's passports. And instead of seeing it as something Jewish and they're upset with him, they actually are dealing with the fact that he has provided light. What a story. And so the question of Hanukkah is, are you assimilated? You look just like the world, or are you set apart from the world? And so I want to read another story for you on this second of our two Hanukkah broadcasts. Again, a true story. And this one comes out of the concentration camp at Bergen-Belsen, and it's Hanukkah in Bergen-Belsen. Let me read it. In their very essence, a Jew and despair are contradictory. They simply cannot coexist together. Rabbi Shmuel Schnetzler, who went by the more familiar name of Rabbi Shmelki, looked around the barracks to make sure that others had understood his point. Amidst the crowd of weary faces that stared back at him, there were a few who were nodding their heads in agreement. Perhaps they too had been Hasidim in another life, the life that existed before the war. And so they could appreciate the tales that Rabbi Shmelki told about Hasidic rabbis of former days. Rabbi Shmelki didn't tell his stories just to pass the time. His job, as he saw it, was to keep up the spirit of the Jews who were imprisoned in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. That job would have been much easier if they were prophets, since the end of the war was just a few months away. But during that Kislev of 1944, the situation seemed as hopeless as ever. Even the thought of Hanukkah, which was fast approaching, couldn't dispel the gloom for most of them. For Rabbi Shmelki, it was a different story. Since the beginning of the month, he had been busy preparing for the holiday. He asked the same question to everyone he met. Can you get us a little oil? Do you know someone who works in the kitchen? The answer was always the same. No. Hanukkah was only a few days away now, and he had to find some oil. With dismay, he realized that Hanukkah was only those days away, and he knew only too well what would happen if he couldn't find any oil. Many of his fellow prisoners were clinging to life only by a slender thread of hope. Once that thread was snapped, they would succumb to the deep sea of dark despair that threatened to drown them. So he had to find some oil. Even if he found only enough oil to kindle the first Hanukkah candle for a few seconds, that would be enough. But no Hanukkah lights? That wasn't an option. The day before Hanukkah, Rabbi Shmelki was at work. His other job on the camp was to remove dead bodies from the barracks, when he received an order to go to the last barrack where some people had died during the previous night. While he walked across a field, his foot got caught in a small hole in the frozen earth, and he almost fell. He removed his foot from the hole and noticed that there was something buried inside. After making sure that no guards were watching him, he knelt down to see what it was. He pulled out a small jar from the ground. Inside was some congealed liquid. "Oil," he whispered. "Oil for Hanukkah." Rabbi Shmelki then reached his hand inside the hole a second time. To his delight, he discovered that the hiding place contained more surprises. He pulled out a carefully wrapped package and quickly undid the paper wrapping. Inside were 8 little cups and 8 thin strands of cotton. It was obvious that some Jewish prisoner had buried this little menorah and the oil. But who was he? And where was he? Had he been transported to another camp? Had he died? Although Rabbi Shmelki desperately wanted oil for his own barracks, he sincerely hoped that the Jew who had buried these things was still alive. Perhaps he was still in the camp and he would come back the next day and search for the treasure he had so carefully hidden. So Rabbi Shmelki carefully reburied everything. But the rest of the day and night he asked every Jew that he met the same question. "I found some oil and a menorah. Maybe you were the one that hid them?" The other prisoners looked at him with sad eyes, certain that at last the horrors of the rabbi's work had destroyed his mind. "No, Rabbi," they said one after another. "I didn't hide any oil. I didn't hide a menorah." The next night, however, they discovered that Rabbi Shmelki hadn't gone mad. When they returned to their barracks after the evening roll call, they saw to their amazement a little menorah standing on one of the bunks. To their even greater surprise, one of the cups was filled with oil. Rabbi Shmelki recited the blessings and then kindled the light for the first night. The group watched in silence while the tiny flames fought its eternal battle against the surrounding darkness. Some smiled, others cried. All felt a sweet spark of hope revive inside their embattled and embittered hearts. Their own personal miracle was repeated on each night of the holiday. And then a few months later, in April 1945, an even greater miracle occurred. Germany surrendered. The war was over. Rabbi Shmelki was one of the fortunate few who survived the war. After Bergen-Belsen was liberated, he returned to Hungary, where he served as a spiritual leader for other survivors and became known as a Takaber Rav. Several years later, he made a trip to the United States, and while he was there, he paid a visit to an acquaintance from the old country, Rabbi Teitelbaum, the Satmar Rebbe. While they reminisced, the Satmar Rebbe mentioned that he had also been a prisoner in Bergen-Belsen. "I was there a year before you," said the Satmar Rebbe. "I was rescued on the 21st of Kislev, 4 days before Hanukkah. Before I found out about the rescue plan, I made provisions for the holiday. I bribed several camp officials and put together a package of oil, cup, and wicks, which I buried in a field. I always felt badly that my little menorah was never put to use." Rabbi Shmelki smiled. "Your menorah was used. It dispelled the darkness for hundreds of Jews and helped at least one of them survive the war." What an amazing story and a coincidence, we might say, that here Rabbi Shmelki finds this package for Hanukkah when he's crying out to God, I need something so I can put light in the midst of this darkness, for even the spark of a light can give hope to the soul, enough hope to get us through another day, another month, until finally the war is over. And to think that he would find what another Jew had buried there is miraculous. But that years later he would meet the very Jew who planted that in the ground. I mean, God is an amazing God. God has moeds, he has divine appointments, God has intersections in our life. There are people that your life might cross during this holiday season, and you've got a word of light, you've got a word of truth, you've got something you can share with them, you've got word that you've heard on this broadcast, or you watch perhaps our Sunday noontime service broadcast, and something of God's Word got hold of you, and now you can pass that word onto another family member or a friend. Maybe in the midst of despair, that word which you have is a word of light to them. And you see, you can pass that on and it can light up their life. And I may never know that where you got that from was a word that I shared, but it could be that in eternity our paths cross. And you'll say, you know, Pastor, I heard a word that you shared, and here's what happened, and I never knew what happened to that word. You see, that's why I take the time to put these broadcasts together. That's why I take the time to put the broadcast of our Sundays on Sunday for you to watch our Sabbath service. It's because it only takes one word. One word from God can change your eternal destiny. One word from God, one moment of insight and understanding can turn from darkness to light, from despair to hope. That's what this season is all about. That's what Hanukkah is all about. That a time when it seemed that the nation would no longer exist, at a time when left and right Jews were abandoning their faith and trying to make themselves look like Greeks because that's what was supposed to, there were a group of committed believers in Yahweh. There were the Maccabees and others living around the land that they could call together and say, no, it's time to stand up against this political correctness that would say we can't practice our Judaism, we got to pretend we're Jews. It's time to do that. And I think that sounds very familiar, because you and I are living in a day and age right now where the church in America, so much of it is just turning to look like the world. Oh, your music's this way, we can have that kind of music. Oh, you dress this way, we can dress this way. Oh, you think that this is what marriage is, or you think these are right sexual morality. Yeah, well, we'll adopt it too so we look like the world. And as we look at like the world, then the nation begins to fall into disrepair, and the nation becomes threatened as no longer the leader in the world it once was. But you know, there's a rising voice. There are those around this nation who are standing up and beginning to say, enough is enough. Enough of political correctness that won't call it the way it is. Enough of letting others take away the roots of our country, of denying that the history of this nation is well founded in the scriptures, the Bible. Enough of people who say we never were a Christian nation. Let's get back to the Supreme Court in the middle 1800s that made its decision and said America is a Christian nation. Let's not be silenced because people will think it's politically incorrect to say that's wrong. We need a voice that begins to speak up. And that's beginning to happen. I had someone years ago in ministry who shared a vision that he had of what was happening in New England. And he said, you know what I saw in my vision? I saw a little flickering light. And a little flickering light in the midst of gross darkness in New England. A light began to burn in Connecticut, and then one in Massachusetts, and one in Vermont, and one in New Hampshire, and one in Maine. And then suddenly there were 2 or 3 lights beginning to burn in these states. And as I watched in my vision, these little tiny lights were breaking out all over New England. And they weren't mammoth lights, they were little lights, a little light here and a little light here. But as more and more of the little lights began to blaze, pretty soon they began to connect, and 5 little lights here and 10 little lights here began to connect, and now you began to have some brighter beacons of light flashing in the states. He said, Pastor, I believe that what I saw was an image of the revival that's going to happen. It's not going to be some massive wave that happens, but it's going to be men and women like you and me who dare to be the light in the world, who dare to speak truth, who are unafraid to say this is what's right, this is what's wrong, who are unafraid to pick up their Bible and say, this Bible speaks truth, who are unafraid in this season of all seasons to go out and say, we are celebrating the birth of Yeshua. We are celebrating who Jesus is, that we don't need to say happy holidays, but we can talk about the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, whose season is supposed to be celebrated. That we are bold enough to say it's not about a man in a red suit with a white beard called Santa Claus bringing gifts to people. It's about our Heavenly Father, who loved the world so much that He gave a gift. He gave His only begotten Son, so that if you would believe in Him, you wouldn't have to perish, but that you could have life, and that life would be everlasting. And so we celebrate Hanukkah. We celebrate the lighting in the midst of darkness, because that so speaks of our Lord, that He is the light of the world. And no, Muhammad is not the way. And no, Buddha isn't the way. No, Yeshua said, I am the way, the truth, the life. No one comes to the Father unless you come through me. Now, that's not very politically correct, but I suggest to you, then you need to make a decision. If Yeshua isn't the only way to get to God, then He lied. And that means He's a liar. He's not worthy to be followed. Well, maybe He didn't lie. Maybe He was deluded. Maybe He was mentally off base. Maybe He really wasn't the Son of God, but He just thought He was. Well, again, I suggest you don't follow Him. If He's a madman, He's not worthy of your allegiance. If He's a liar and a con artist, He's not worthy of your allegiance. But the other option, testified to by millions and millions of people through history, is that He is who He says He is. He's the Son of the living God. As Philip said to Him one day, Lord, show us the Father, and that would satisfy us. And Yeshua said, Philip, have I been with you so long and you do not know? If you've seen me, you've seen Abba. You've seen the Father. I am, as Paul says, He is the direct revelation of the full character of God. This can be the season of light for you, a season when Yeshua becomes your Lord. This is Pastor Don Long. I'm sure glad you chose to spend the time this week with us. We look forward to sharing with you again next week.